Hey folks, it's Michael with the Reason RX podcast. So today we're going to talk about a gentleman. We're going to talk to a gentleman, an interview, who I know from a podcast called the Education Bookcast. It's one I recommend. He does some good stuff. Talks about books about education and what you can learn from them. And one thing I like is because he doesn't, for example, do as a lot of people do and think, okay, I teach math, so I just need to know more math and know more about math teaching, and let me just study that and just focus on that and hyper-focus. An important thing about teaching and learning and thinking and being human is to integrate. Cognitive integration is a fundamental logical skill. And so I like that this guy talks about and tries to learn from Bruce Lee and books about Bruce Lee, John Wooden, the basketball coach, game design, other things. You can see, I'll put a link to his podcast in the show notes, and you can look up some of them, listen to him, see his discussion. So that's an important thing, looking broadly to find out how to do things. Like, for example, a teacher might want to look into theater or acting to know how to make the classes more interesting. Look at writing literature and how that's done to know how to pace things better. And then he also gets into really good discussion, in depth about this. It's not superficial. That's another good, important thing about reasoning and being logical, which clearly helps us teach better, produce better students, think better, live a better life. So he'll look at whether some idea is valid, if he believes it, what the research is, how it relates to something else, some good thinking skills involved there. That's what I like. So, without further ado, to use a phrase I heard recently that I've forgotten that I haven't said for a while, I'll let him introduce himself and tell us about his background and his podcast and what he does. So, hello, would you introduce yourself and pronounce your name?
Hello, I'm Stash. That's short for Stanislaw Pstrokonski, so you can just use Stash if you want.
What nationality is that? Sorry.
It's Polish, yeah.
Okay. That's why I didn't try to pronounce it.
I just Polish said origin, yeah.
I didn't want to butcher it. Go ahead, sorry.
Anyway, so yeah, I'm in London, so I might be your furthest away sort of collocutor so far.
Yeah.
So I have a podcast, as you mentioned. Thank you very much for the introduction, called Education Bookcast, which I started about 4 years ago because I was basically, my career had moved into education at that stage, into teaching essentially full time, and I wanted to improve. And I thought that, what ways could I possibly improve as someone involved in this? And I thought I needed to know more about the education research, of which there is a huge amount. And so I started reading lots of books. And in the first year of that, I read 60 books. And I also was trying to get information from other sources because I felt like I couldn't get the information fast enough. And looking at podcasts was one way to look at it. And there were some about books as well. And I thought maybe I can learn about books without having to always read them, or at least know beforehand what I'm getting into. But mostly they seem to be interested in, for example, they wouldn't get into the content of the books enough, so I wouldn't really know what was going on. And eventually I just realized I could be the one to do this because I have enough free time comparatively to other teachers, for example, because I was doing private stuff. You don't have as much admin and you don't have as many hours. So yeah, that's how I got into that. And I've been doing that for 4 years, and hopefully I've learned a lot. I feel like there's still much left. Mm-hmm. Well, rather, I feel like there have also been things that at first I believed, or at first I had certain kinds of ideas which have changed, which obviously is likely to happen when you're going through a long journey like this. So that's pretty much me, I guess. I mean, I've also worked in some educational technology startups in London as well, working on literacy and on the kind of e-learning platforms and stuff. So that's another side of stuff that I've been doing. So I guess that's a good enough introduction.
Yeah. So you've been involved in education in 4 years, or for 4 years, or more than 4? Or?
Well, 4 years is how long the podcast has been around. This is the first academic year where I'm not teaching since 2010. So I have been doing teaching at least a bit for some form of teaching for the past, say, about 8 years, and then recently I've also done some work in educational technology in the meantime as well. That was partly side projects, and then it actually was a full-time job for the last year and a half.
Cool. Did you start teaching just out of college, or have some other jobs, or what?
I was an engineer for a year and a half. It didn't go so well, and then I ended up getting into teaching instead.
Cool. What kind of engineer were you?
Chemical engineering.
Okay, like bachelor's or PhD or what?
Well, I had a master's degree in engineering, and I worked in a engineering consultancy.
Okay,
But fine, yeah.
cool. Um, and so you taught mainly literacy or math or science or what?
Oh, predominantly maths and science, yeah. Literacy, actually, I got a lot into when I was working in a certain educational company where literacy was the main focus. So I ended up learning a lot about reading and that sort of thing, vocabulary.
Hmm. And then when you've taught in schools, it's been math and science.
So I have taught in school and I've taught maths in school, but out of school, I've done private tuition or private tutoring, or I've taught for various sort of private organizations, private classes, which was also maths and science.
Hmm. Which math courses have you taught in science? Which in particular?
I think it might be that the system over here is a bit different, and there's kind of a unitary, much more unitary approach. It's not quite so modular. So, I mean, okay, I haven't done that much biology, to be fair. It's mostly physics and chemistry,
Hmm.
but yeah, in maths, like I've taught everything up to A level, further maths, and step exams. Step exams, these special exams you take to get into Cambridge University.
Hmm.
Like A level, further maths. A level is sort of like the high school diploma thing, but you choose your specific subject. Further maths is when you kind of do a double diploma in maths, kind of. It's a bit weird to explain. It's like instead of spending, I don't know, instead of having 4 lessons a week of maths, you have 8 lessons a week of maths, and you do like loads more, and you get into some sort of university material. So I've taught that. Yeah, I'm not sure how much I can, how I can answer your question in the way that you intended me to, because I think we're working in different systems here.
Yeah, yeah, I've got some experience with some of that, working with some kids who go to international schools and getting an IB degree. Um, Worked with a kid via the internet, homeschool kid overseas, um, A level stuff and all that, that kind of thing. We didn't get up to A level, I think, because he was younger, but somewhat familiar with that. But you do in that basically you go up through pre-calculus and calculus, like calculus, like trigonometry is what we call pre-cal over here. Some analysis, the mathematical analysis you need before you get into calculus.
Hmm.
Is that what y'all work on?
Yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of things. We've got like,
Yeah.
sure, you got algebra and trigonometry and calculus and probability theory and statistics and mechanics. So we kind of do like mathematical physics, and there's even a little bit of something called decision maths, which is kind of like about algorithms. It's sort of like linear programming, it's basic computer science type of things. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty calculus heavy on the whole.
Hmm.
It's pretty physics oriented, I would say.
Hmm. And then on physics, do you do both like calculus based physics over like when you're working with kids and non-calculus based?
Um, well, are you asking me whether I teach that? Yeah, I do teach both of those.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's kind of what I was wondering. Right. But cool. Um, and so let me see. Look at my questions. So what kept you interested in teaching? Like, why'd you stay there instead of getting bored and not liking it like engineering and moving on to something else?
Um, well, that's not actually such an easy question. I guess the high level answer is maybe something like I'm constantly learning things myself, so it's just something that interests me personally. Like I want to understand how I learn. It's important to me. Secondly, I have the sense that learning about teaching, learning about learning about education is basically a social good, and I would like to do good things rather than evil things, if possible. And yeah, and then thirdly, it's just this. It's actually sometimes it's infuriating for this, but it's a really tough puzzle. It's like it's very hard to understand. I feel that I do understand some parts of it now, or at least understand it reasonably well. But it's just a really tough puzzle to crack. It's a bit like sometimes it feels like chemistry before the periodic table. It's lots of it's hard to know how to link together all the facts. It's hard to know where to look for the most important things. I do tend to go on a kind of eclectic journey through lots of different sources. I have tended to do a lot of that, and yeah, I guess it's something that overall, as long as I have some sense that I'm making some progress, then I want to keep going, because if it's taken me this many years to figure out this little in a way, then I suppose you could say a lot of people must be really stuck, or must not, really not know anything about how this stuff works. So hopefully it's helpful to people. That's my main motivation, really, is that it's helpful to people, and that it's, I suppose, interesting for me.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of same here. It's a very complicated subject, teaching, so much involved. Um, the subject you're working on, how it relates to human life, um, logic, knowledge, emotion, presenting material, dealing with people, a lot to it. Probably one of the most complicated things there are out there.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, that's for sure.
Yeah, but cool. And then, yeah, I like that there's always things to do and things to find out. It doesn't get so boring and redundant. Because of the nature of it, it is like you're saying and implying, there's so many avenues of research and so much you can do on the journey. It keeps it very interesting all the time. So what are some of the things, like what are some uh, ideas that you had before about education that you've changed your mind about?
Okay, so now we're getting into the meat of things. Okay, so well, I think the number one thing that I suppose I regret advocating to some extent is discovery learning. Although I didn't call it by that name at the time, but yeah, discovery learning. So this ties in with an important principle in cognitive science about working memory and the limitations of working memory capacity. Discovery learning is something that I encountered through a few sources, but the main sources were math circles, which is a certain kind of way of teaching maths that actually I went to the United States specifically to attend a course about, because I was so interested in them, and they really fascinated me, and I thought they were really promising. And there's also this really interesting article called Lockhart's Lament. It's actually called A Mathematician's Lament, but people normally refer to it as Lockhart's Lament because it's written by someone whose surname is Lockhart. I can't remember his first name. So he talks all about how it's unfortunate. In fact, unfortunate is a bit of a weak word. He's very strongly worded in his article, how it's basically terrible the way that we teach maths, and that we're teaching kids like in order to make them trained monkeys, and we're not really getting them to think. And then he gave examples of what real thinking is like, and what maths is really about, and what maths is really like. And I could really sympathize with him. I was kind of 50-50 on how much I agreed with him, but I could definitely sympathize with his point of view. And it was part of this story around the math circles, really, because I haven't described what they're like, but basically it's you set a problem, and then everyone works together on solving this relatively large and often rather amorphous problem. Sometimes there can be times when the problem isn't actually very well stated, and part of the process is to figure out how to state the problem better, although you don't tell them at the beginning that you've stated the problem poorly. So it is very interesting as a thinking exercise, but the trouble is that it's actually very, very inefficient as a learning exercise because of the cognitive science around this sort of thing. I haven't gone into loads and loads of detail on my podcast on this. I've mostly sort of made asides in various episodes to talk about this, but I am planning a sort of a sequence of episodes to talk about this in great detail, about why it's important to understand cognitive load theory or the limitations of working memory, as I mentioned. Now, I'm going to stop here because I could now talk for 20 minutes about cognitive load theory. I don't know if that's what you want me to do.
Just talk on. Yeah.
You want to know more? Okay. So basically, it's this idea that we can split up the mind into two parts. Actually, there's another source which I refer to or I use where it's split up into three parts, but it doesn't really interfere. It's basically the same model. So splitting up into two parts, you've got working memory and long-term memory. And if you were to add a third part, then that would be essentially your emotions, like the emotional part of your mind, which is not really it's not really the same as your working memory or your long-term memory. So your working memory is kind of like what you're currently aware of, what you can remember from the last few seconds and what you're currently thinking about. So it's almost like your consciousness, basically, you can say, is your working memory. And your long-term memory is all the stuff that you know, all of your knowledge, basically, is in your long-term memory. And this includes, so it's a bit of a catch-all term, really, because it includes declarative knowledge and it includes procedural knowledge as well. So things you know, things you're able to do, any kind of memory, more or less, that isn't short-term memory would be classed as long-term in your long-term memory. And what happens when with your working memory that's very important is that it's limited in space. It can only encompass a small number of ideas at a time. The number of ideas. The thing about this is that as soon as you start talking about ideas, then it's difficult to say, how big is an idea and so on. So when I say number of ideas, it's not entirely clear how many we can say, because obviously it depends on how big those ideas are and whatever it means for an idea to be big. But we're talking between about 2 to 7 things can fit in your working memory at once. So it might be like 7 digits that you could just remember with no scheme. Just like a random string of digits, you could remember about 7 digits, but you wouldn't be able to remember any more. And one of the digits would pop out of your memory, unless you had a special kind of trick, which would use your long-term memory as well as your working memory to do this. So what this means is that whenever you are thinking about something, your mind will be overloaded if you have more than a certain number of ideas that you're trying to combine at once. And when you have something like discovery learning, so you have a problem where you're not told how to solve it or how to approach it, and you're sort of meant to think about it on your own, then there are too many different facets and too many different approaches to take. And then you've got a limited amount of capacity in your working memory. So you're going to end up, as a beginner at least, you're going to end up basically approaching it whatever way seems sensible to you, and you're going to waste a lot of time thinking about things which don't actually contribute to your knowledge. What would be a much more efficient way to do it, which is much more normal teaching, basically, especially for beginners, is when you have a much more guided sense of what you're supposed to be doing. When you have a problem that is much more within the realm of, it's basically like the problem is within the realm of your capacity. You have some, so you've just been shown a principle, for example, and then it's about application of that principle, and it's much more guided like that. Now, a lot of people have criticized that along the lines of things like that's boring or that doesn't get people to think. But the cognitive science shows that gets people to learn things. And if you use discovery learning, then they don't really learn very much at all. And this changes over people's competence. So the most important factor in learning styles, this is slightly moving into a different topic, but not really. So there's this thing called learning styles, which a lot of people are quite believe in. It's actually something like 90% of university students in the US. I have a lot of data about the US because a lot of people write about it in English. But roughly, but based on studies of this kind, roughly 90% of university students in the US will have some sense of belief in the idea of learning styles. But the actual research shows that there is no evidence for any theory of, like, there are a bunch of theories of learning styles, but there's actually no evidence to support the theories, really. The only kind of thing that is really important learning style wise is your level of competence. So if you're a beginner, you learn in one way, and if you're intermediate, you learn somewhat in another way, and if you're advanced, you learn in a different way. So discovery learning is something that can be used with people who are quite advanced. If someone is quite good at something, you can use discovery learning with them and it will work quite well. But if they're a beginner, it's going to work terribly. And this is part of the reason why it's so beguiling. It's part of the reason why it's so easy to believe in, like I did, because I am effectively an expert. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm a mathematician whiz, but compared to the kids I teach, I am a mathematician whiz. Right, I'm great at what I do compared to them. So when I see an interesting problem, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. It gets me to think, and I actually probably would learn a lot by trying to solve like a really poorly formulated, weird question. But the thing is, I've got loads of things already in my long-term memory which are helping me, and means I have to rely less on space in my working memory. I'm likely to take a good strategy. I'm likely to approach it in a good way. So it works better for me. Because I'm an expert, but then it's so easy, and people do this all the time. It's called expert blindness. It's so easy to sort of see your own competence and what you think is like, oh, but this is the way I learn, or like this is the way that something that I think would get me to think or whatever, and then sort of assuming that this is going to work, or this is going to be the best for whoever you're teaching who is a beginner. And trouble is, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And folks, really quickly, about the learning style things, I've got 2 podcasts we've done about that in the past. You can look them up with teacher Scott Harris in San Antonio. We've discussed that quite a bit as well. One thing about the discovery I think they might not be taken into account is just general logic and how the mind functions. We still got to learn more about that. We already know some, so I think people need to get their epistemology right. Of course, for those who don't know, theory of knowledge, what a concept is, what a proposition is, how we know things, what's truth, how we think. So logic is part of epistemology, but it's much more broad than that. I'm wondering if when we get more advanced with teaching and knowledge, when people get more unified on a good epistemology, discovery learning might be able to be used if people can sculpt it as like Montessori does. So if you can not just make up a discovery problem for kids, but you got to construct the whole context and environment for them and then do discovery within that. So maybe they can do this little discovery thing. So it'd be kind of more like what you're saying, give them the principle and let them go. So they'd have some of that constructed already. But it sounds like it's like a discovery problem for someone who's advanced, where you've already got this broader context to come up with these new tools that maybe haven't even been developed yet in math. I think maybe that could be part of the thing, getting the context of the discovery right and couching it correctly, getting all the room and the furniture all set, and then just going like that. But I generally agree.
So there are a few things to unpack there, if I may.
A lot.
So one is you're talking about logic and epistemology, and the second thing is you're talking about Montessori education. So I think I'll talk about Montessori first. So I don't know huge amounts about Montessori education. I mean, I am basically familiar with the idea, and I have read a book about it, but I haven't covered it on the podcast. But I don't know like loads and loads. But from what I understand of Montessori education, it does seem like, basically as you were just describing, that you are setting up an environment in such a way that the environment effectively provides guidance. So it feels a bit like play, like what the kids are doing, or in a way that what they're doing is play, but there is a kind of guidance towards some kind of instructional goal. And these things are very carefully, Maria Montessori herself very carefully designed these things to make that as much as possible the case. So it does seem a bit like, even though it might feel a bit like a discovery environment, there is a lot of guidance that's provided by a careful design of the learning environment. That's my view, my take on it. And then the other thing about epistemology and logic, this is where this is another place where, I mean, basically I'm going to have to somewhat disagree with you. So
good.
So logic is, or okay. I'm going to try and this. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to get this very linear, but let me see what I can do. So yes, it's important to understand epistemology when you're learning a field, like say maths is a good example. So the epistemology of maths is based on deriving things from axioms, right? Axiomatic proof
Well, maybe
is
that's
the
what we um, are taught, and that's like the general consensus. But I'm not sure if that's actually true. I know someone who's doing some research on that. Um, I'll put a link to her in the podcast if I remember, but I'm not sure, as I say, if that's
well,
actually true, even though that's the conventional wisdom view, and I can't, I'm not genius enough to go one way or the other and actually prove one way or another, but yeah, but sorry,
so
go ahead.
the epistemology here. I mean, you say you're raising doubts about that being the epistemology of maths, but I understand. I mean, do you mean something like it might be that research is actually not done that way? Is that what your contention is, or do you
Yeah,
mean like that's not how we know whether things are true or not?
for epistemology or math in particular.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you mean the first or the second? Do you mean maybe researchers actually work differently than that, or do you mean this isn't really the way that we determine, the ultimate arbiter of truth?
Um, like for the axioms in math, you mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Particular? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think um, that idea comes about from Platonic thinking a long time ago, from the ancient Greeks. And yeah, well, they accepted it, and it's been conveyed forward in history. That in itself doesn't make it correct. Um, if you look at, for example, how Galileo or Archimedes did some things, they didn't just deduce stuff, or even Newton. They looked at reality and then figured out how things worked and went from there.
Okay.
Concrete things were springboards, motivations, um, and sources to abstract from to develop the ideas. Like I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
I don't see how you can deduce calculus from the axioms. That's like that idea is bizarre to me. How you can like step by step deduce it. I think we can get an idea, and then just like physics, you can put on a deductive basis after you've induced it. I think math is similar. Um, so we can get some ideas, and yeah, we can relate them to the axioms, but that doesn't mean that's how we like. It doesn't mean math is essentially and entirely deductive and self-contained. I think there's some problems with that. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question, or do I need to say?
At the end, at the end, it went in a different direction than I expected. I mean, what it sounded like for most of what you were saying is that it looks like people don't actually do research that way. They don't do research in a deductive way. They do research in a way where, like, they use their intuitions and they use their experiences, and that informs how they try and come up with new theorems in maths or whatever. But then at the end, you seem to say that actually that it might not be a good basis for truth itself. I mean, this might be going too far outside of the topic for how much we have time for. But
Yeah.
if anything, right, this is kind of moving into the sort of the point I was wanting to make, which is that generally mathematicians will demand like proof as in order to demonstrate things are true. That's the normal way that that's sort of ordinary maths. That's the way that mathematicians convince each other of new theorems. But in terms of the way people think, exactly, that we can talk about the epistemology of maths, and the standard epistemology of maths is the deduction from axioms, right? But that's not the way that people think about it. That's like a lot of the time. That's not the way that people would research it, and it's also not the way that people are likely to learn it. And that's because you made a point a little bit earlier about how maybe we'd be able to improve discovery learning or improve other aspects of learning by focusing on epistemology. And I feel like that might be, I mean, in particular, given this is a good example of it, right? If the way that we decide whether things are true or not is different from the best way to learn them, then focusing on epistemology isn't going to improve the way people learn things. That we need to look at it cognitively rather than. So we need to look at like how people think rather than how people accept arguments about what is true, which is kind of what epistemology is more about.
Well, I disagree. I mean, but that's one thing. I'm glad we're like having a discussion, get people to think about it. Just bringing up epistemology, what it is, because we're using the same word, but that doesn't mean we're talking about the same thing, and that's an important point. Or people can use the word teaching, but that doesn't mean they're talking about the same thing. Or someone can talk about learning or teaching to you, and they can have a certain meaning behind it, but because of all the study you've done, Stash, you've got, so much more about it. Your experience, the books you've read, the thinking you've done, all the cognitive integrations you made, it doesn't even mean the same thing. But with epistemology, yeah, we'd have to define it, give examples, see what the context is, see where we get the concept and all this stuff. And yeah, I don't know if
I feel like we were just doing that right now. Actually, we were just doing exactly those steps. But anyway, I mean, cool. the other point that I wanted to raise or to contest in a way was because I know, and this might be close to your heart, because I know, I mean, even the title of your podcast, Reason. It seems like you're very, from what I understand, you have a lot of like sort of philosophical and mathematical background. You have a lot of sort of belief in the importance of logic and things like this, right? Is that true? Do you have a lot of belief in the importance of logic?
Yes, but then again,
yes.
What is logic? What does it mean? So we might not be talking about the same thing, but I'm glad you bring it up. Question it. That's what we need.
I mean, I'd like to think that we have some sense of agreement about what logic is, but I mean, it would really be a long conversation if we were trying to decide what it is. But anyway, on the assumption that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about logic, so I think this is a very common and natural thing to say and think about education and about thinking. Is in fact, you see it in lots of places that people need, for example, to improve their thinking skills. So they need to be critical thinkers, or they need to be logical thinkers, or they need to approach things rationally. I saw a book recently in a bookshop that said, literally the title was "Why Critical Thinking Will Save Us." Mm-hmm. And basically, so I'm pretty sure there's quite a big problem with this, right? That is that. What is deemed logical, or people will often give this criticism, they'll level this criticism at someone. They'll say, this person just isn't thinking logically, or this person just isn't thinking rationally. Whereas what's really happening is that person is lacking some kind of knowledge, or they're seeing things from a different perspective, which is all based on memory. It's all based on learned things, rather than it's all based on stuff they know or don't know, rather than based on their skills in thinking. So, it's even been shown that when you do something like, suppose that, so we're going back to maths, suppose that you're teaching someone a logical set of steps, and it is a logical set of steps to, for example, solve a certain kind of maths problem. Or prove a theorem. I mean, whatever. Like, do some maths thing. Like solving a maths problem would be an example, and or derive a certain formula. That would be probably a better example. So every step when you're doing it, you feel like you are being logical. You feel like you are going through a sequence of reasoned steps, and it's like this and this produce this reasoned result, and that's exactly what it feels like. But actually, what's going on is you're actually remembering a proof. It's based on memory. And so, like, most of reasoning is actually memory because of the limited size of the working memory capacity, that you wouldn't be able to like, the first time you think about something hard like that, it's like your whole working memory is occupied and it's really hard to think about. It becomes increasingly easy to think about because you're increasingly relying on your memory rather than relying on your conscious ability to think. Right, it's like things are coming back from your memory, and the idea of things can be reasonable because they make sense, but they make sense because you've already inserted them into your knowledge base. You've already inserted them into your long-term memory. So, in fact, a lot of the time, I mean, it's easy to do it with people, for example, with literacy as well. If somebody can't understand a passage with a reading, it's easy to say something like, well, they need to think critically about this text, or they need to, or some such similar injunction. But in fact, much of the time it's something like they don't have the requisite vocabulary, and that's why they're stuck. So they need more knowledge, right? Vocabulary is knowledge. Or they don't understand the meaning of the terms in the passage. Well, that's basically vocabulary as well. It might be that they've heard of these terms, but they don't understand them in detail. And then that's, again, knowledge. It's like knowledge is much more important to thinking than is commonly understood.
But then the way a lot of people use the word logic, I disagree because I don't think a lot of people really know what they mean. Um, they don't have a valid concept of logic. There's a lot of because of all the philosophical influences out there. I think a lot of people are mistaken to various degrees about what it is, and so even like logic, thinking, science, a lot of people throw the words around, or they think they're a PhD in science. They have a PhD in science, so they know what it is, but if that was the case, then Johns Hopkins wouldn't have to have their R3 program in like a biological medical field. Um, there's R3 program. They've got to teach their graduate students how to do science, how to think, how to be logical, because they're not learning it in high school. They're not learning it in their undergrad. And these people that in the program found out, by looking at what scientists are doing, practicing scientists who've already had their PhD, that's the evidence they've used to get their conclusion that it's not being learned, and so they got to institute this R3 program to help out their grad students. And like Rice, one of the better, like number 16 university in the U.S., they have to have an engineering leadership program. Teaches engineers different things like entrepreneurship, how to communicate, how to think, some things like that, some things beyond the quote-unquote traditional program of just memorization. And then, having a degree in philosophy, knowing the background of it, knowing something about the history of it, knowing some, but of course, being a student, never calling myself a master, because I know there's all kinds of things to learn forever, but a lot of mistakes in philosophy about what logic and epistemology are that are conveyed out into the general culture. So some people might think they're being logical, but I would question whether they know what logic actually is. And even some researchers who are doing work on it, I wouldn't agree with whether they're actually doing science or logic. And like I'm not the only one. You got those people at the universities, or let's see, forgot this lady who wrote this book about food in America. I'll put it in the show notes, but with the research she did for the book, looking at so-called scientific research about food and fat and health, she's come to the point where she no longer believes any scientific research until she's looked at it herself. The evidence, the reasoning, what they're saying. So I think there's that broader context we need to look at about whether people are being logical and sorry, what?
Just about the last point with the food lady, lady looking at nutrition science. Yeah, I mean that feels feels somewhat reminiscent to what the state is a bit in the education world. Yeah. It feels like,
just
unfortunately,
like what you said about brain-based learning and the book about brain-based learning that you had a podcast about. Yeah, same thing. I like that episode. I'd recommend that too. I think maybe I'll link to your podcast in general, but maybe to some specific episodes, the ones that I've heard, just because I've heard them, not that they're the best, but John Wooden, Bruce Lee, the one about brain-based learning, that was really good.
Sure, thank you.
But yeah, I'm glad you're bringing up some of these ideas and having some disagreement for discussion, get people to think about this, get each of us to think about this stuff more, add a different perspective. That's good. But so we were talking about discovery learning and the circles thing. Then we had to
math circles,
then you had to get into some short-term memory and long-term memory. Could we circle back? Not no pun intended, but could we circle back to the circles thing and What was that exactly? Could you like define that and describe that in more
Yeah,
detail, please? Or did I miss
sure.
that?
So this is actually inspired by it was actually inspired by a Russian thing originally. They had these literature circles where people would come together and they'd all read a book and then they'd talk about it with each other. And then they started doing this with maths, where you'd have a problem and you'd work on it together, and it would be and it'd be fun for the people. And then they started trying this kind of thing in other countries. It was actually in a few different countries in Eastern Europe, and then some enterprising individuals took it over to the United States. And there's kind of two schools of this. So there are some people who do this to prepare for competition, like maths competition, like the mathematical Olympiad. And there are some people who do it in a much more kind of open and just kind of let's think about maths and enjoy it kind of way. And it does seem. I mean, I've actually tried to teach. I've been on a course. I've tried to teach some. My experience of it is much less positive. My direct experience of it is much less positive than what I read about, and I wondered how much that's my own skills. I do feel like it, and there is a little bit of evidence around discovery learning that sometimes it has a positive impact on motivation and on attitudes. So sometimes people just come out feeling like they like maths more, which is great. Um, but it does seem like you can't really make it the core of, there are some cognitive reasons why this can be problematic, basically, and which I've been digging into. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Hmm. Okay. Now I get what you mean by circles. I thought you meant something different, but then with the idea of like literary circle and people reading books, that makes it make more sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think now that mentioning the discovery thing and all that, I think I'm having a student working with a student now. Algebra 2, he's having trouble with the exact same thing because his teacher thinks that that's like the greatest thing since sliced bread or whatever, and he claims that MIT does this and MIT has success, and so that's what he's going to do to teach. And he gives the students these problems, and this kid is just lost, like
Mm.
they're doing some probability in the binomial distribution, and
Hmm.
instead of starting out with the basics, developing the binomial distribution, doing some simple everyday problems so students can do something familiar and get a
Mm.
concept of it, and then expanding from there, and then starting to connect that idea in math to other ideas in math in the world. It's just out of nowhere, you get this like abstract problem, and all of a sudden you got to use the binomial like distribution, and it's just crazy.
Yeah, this sounds like exactly a demonstration or a very good example of the kind of problem that you'd encounter. Yeah, it seems like, lots of, it might even be that a small number of people in the class are coping and even thriving, but like I imagine or most of the kids in that class are just going to have a really hard time of it. They're like, what is going on? I'm completely lost. And that's exactly, it's basically working memory overload. Like there's too much information. They don't know what's relevant, don't know how to connect it, don't know
Yeah,
what to do. And then they just have a sense of, it's exasperation and potentially just a sense of failure because, they try and it's just too much and they don't know where they're going to go with it.
yeah, yeah. And like in this one, so last night the guy had four problems. He can choose one of the four, and he chose this problem about okay, you got a multiple choice test, four questions, um, four possibilities, A, B, C, D for 20 questions, A, B, C, D on each one, um, and they go through what's the probability of getting one question right, what's the probability of getting 10, again, out of nowhere when they haven't really developed this stuff much. And all of a sudden
Mm.
there's this question that says, it starts talking about um, you have 20 rows and 1,000 balls and a 0.25 probability, and then 10, 11 up through 20 are bins. And okay, so what's the probability of getting these different things? And they're like, bins, balls? Where the heck did balls and bins come from? It's like, I can't handle this. And
Yeah.
so thankfully I was there to help him relate it. Okay, 1,000 balls would be like 1,000 students. You got the same thing done 1,000 times. The bins like would be getting 10 questions right, 11 right, 20 right. But yeah,
Mm.
it's like um,
Not to mention that there's a serious mathematical modeling problem with assuming that people choose random answers to multiple choice questions.
yeah,
I mean, unless it says something like somebody doesn't know anything and they're
Yeah.
just randomly picking questions. But they probably didn't say that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it did. That was the
um,
context. It's like
oh, okay.
pretend they do it randomly. But yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, but that's a good point. But okay, so that makes more sense about the circles and discovery learning stuff.
Mm.
Um, anything else you want to add on that? Like,
Well, I mean, I feel like we've been talking about it for a while, and I know that there are some other things you wanted to ask me about, so I thought I'd just give you a chance for
cool.
that.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot of good discussion there that could be developed a lot more. Um, so you're doing some teaching of math and physics, and you're working on some electronic web-based learning platforms and things. So what the heck do you learn from a basketball coach, John Wooden?
Okay, nice question. Yeah. So I went out looking for the best teachers of any kind that I could find, and I
Interesting. Yeah.
found three. I
Hmm.
found three who are really good. Unfortunately, I mean, there's this general sort of kind of bias in the literature to the United States. If you're in the United States, it doesn't matter or feel like that way to you. But I live in a different country, very far away, and I've read more books from like just way more books from the United States than from the rest of the world
Hmm.
combined. I've read like
Interesting.
one book from New Zealand and a handful from I don't know, maybe like 10 or so. I don't know how many, but that kind of scale from the UK, and we're talking a scale of like 100 or something from the US. So I feel like there must
Hmm.
be great teachers in the rest of the world, but I just
Hmm.
happened to find these three.
Okay.
Um, so actually, they're not all from the US, but they're all taught in the US. And one of them is John Wooden.
Who are the
Wooden,
others?
like Marva Collins. I mentioned
Hmm.
her. Sorry, I've heard her mentioned on your podcast before, actually.
Okay.
Marva
Cool.
Collins and Jaime Escalante.
Hmm. Okay.
He's also a maths guy. Anyway, so they interestingly, we have an interesting sample because they all taught different ages and they all taught if different age groups. They all taught different subjects as well. So Marva Collins was really her big thing was literacy and literature, and primary school or elementary school. And John Wooden was a university student teaching them basketball, and then Jaime Escalante was this high school maths guy, right? So we got
Hmm.
different ages and stuff. So I was looking at all of those, and John Wooden, yeah, I mean, he was an extraordinary coach. He his achievements speak for themselves.
Hmm.
For themselves, like he won something like his team won 9 out of 10 years in the university basketball um, competitions in
Hmm.
the US,
Well, yeah.
and he was universally revered by his. I mean, revered. I'm not sure if that's a great word, but he was basically he was considered to be wonderful by everyone who knew him. Well, enough so that one of his former students actually wrote this book about him, actually in collaboration with someone else. And yeah, I mean, he's awesome. So that's why I wanted to read about him.
Hmm. What'd you learn?
What did I learn? I think so. In a way, I feel like I learned the most by combining what I learned from him with what I learned from the other two cases. I think that some of the biggest learning points were that he he was very intense. They were all so intense, so intense in terms of like the way that they transmitted knowledge. They were constantly talking about content all the time. So this is actually some people went to study him to actually observe his lessons, his what lessons, training sessions, right, with his team, and he would. They expected him based on the psychology available at the time. They expected that he would be using a lot of different motivational. They would be giving them rewards or punishments or something. That he'd be. It would mostly be about encouragement, but actually, it was not mostly about encouragement. Actually, it was mostly about content. It was mostly about don't do this, do that. Change this, change that, and he had everything planned in an incredibly time efficient way. So everyone was constantly moving, and then the switches between exercises were lightning fast. So there
Hmm.
was just no break, and everything was all the time was used to maximum effect. Another thing that I got from him and from the others, but maybe from him the strongest, was the incredible focus on fundamentals. just this huge focus on you need to be able to do the most basic things, and we're going to practice it every single week. And you practice it every single week, including right up to the final match in the year. They were doing basic passing exercises and things like that. I don't know very much about basketball, but these sorts of basic exercises that they were doing, right up to the very last match. When no other people would just be talking about higher level concepts about strategy. They'd be talking about stuff like that. I mean, they would also do that, but they would never stop working on the fundamentals and make sure they were like really, really, really ingrained. So that, I mean, again, this is a working memory, long-term memory thing. So that it was really strongly in their long-term memory, so they don't have to occupy their working memory with it when they do it, right? So they can automatically do a really good pass. They don't have to think about doing a good pass. They can think about the strategy because they've got that space in their head. Think about it because they've just really honed this. So that was another big thing. His use of drill, his really intense, high content use of drill. In order to get into the fundamentals, like he was really making sure that was happening. He was perceived as very fair to everyone. He was perceived as someone who was, didn't show any favoritism or anything like that. I suppose, I mean, that's good. I mean, people just saw him sort of as a very moral person, a moral figure. I mean, I think that. He used planning. That's another thing. He planned his sessions so that he could be so intense and so that he could focus on fundamentals that much. Like that, he really sort of saw his planning time as sacred in its own way. One of the things that's also really inspiring about all three of these cases, all three of these teachers, is that they all had serious disadvantages. So in the case of the other two teachers, they were dealing with populations which tend to achieve poorly, or at least at the time. I mean, I think it might still be actually it is still true. So, Marva Collins was in a kind of a poor black neighborhood. The expectations, it was not very long after civil rights as well. So
Chicago, right?
Chicago, yeah. So like the expectations of the kids were very low, and the kids had very low expectations of themselves, and she really turned that around. Then Jaime Escalante was in a school with predominantly Latino kids, and that had a similar kind of. Originally, that school had some serious problems with gangs and stuff, and we see a lot of him trying to cope with that in looking at his story.
And was it about to be closed? What was the deal with that one?
Yeah. They switched out some different school principals, in order to fix it, and. Yeah, it was pretty close to closing at one point. It turns out, I mean, it's a long story, but it turns out that one of the principals tried to kind of negotiate with the gangs and get everyone to love each other, and that failed terribly.
And he talks about it. Sorry, Stash talks about it more in his podcast about that. So you can listen to that podcast. It's worth it. Really good ones about Wooten and all that. But sorry, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So there was this disastrous case of him trying to get everyone to love each other, and it totally didn't work. And then there was another guy who tried to have a much more firm hand against that kind of thing, and it helped to some extent. It helped turn the school around. So yeah. Anyway, I mean, I'm just saying that those two teachers, Marva Collins and Jaime Escalante, had a difficult sort of hand dealt to them in terms of the kids they were dealing with. John Wooden had his own difficulties because he didn't have a gym. He had to, the university normally has a basketball court. He didn't actually have a basketball court. He still won the competitions. They had to find ones out somewhere in town. They were so underfunded. He was actually paid very little. So he had some sort of material things which you could easily complain and make excuses about. But it's obviously very admirable in him that he not only did he do what he could, but he ended up having an enormous success by finding ways around it.
Well, yeah, I've read one book, but the guy said that a lot of people who are very successful will come from, poor, disadvantaged environments, like Brazilian soccer players. I don't think he talked about these people, but they go with what he says. When things are all luxurious and taken advantage of, everything's taken care of, people seem to be sloppy and don't strive as hard as they do in these situations.
You might be talking about the book Bounce by Matthew Syed.
No, it's a different one. But thanks for mentioning that. I have to maybe look that up because I haven't read Bounce or even heard of it. But go ahead. Sorry, what?
Yeah, I actually covered that one as well. But
okay, cool.
Yeah, but bounce. But he took. It's sort of a side point, but he mentions how because he's a ping pong champion, like table
Hmm.
tennis. Well, not champion, but he was like reaching semi-finals in the Olympics, this kind of level.
Hmm.
And he talks about basically how they did it, and an element of it is that they had this really this kind of this garage where they had a table tennis table and it was pretty small and there were loads of weeds everywhere. It was really hot in summer, really cold in winter. And then he describes a Spartak tennis club, which is where a lot of the best Russian tennis players have come from, like Anna Kournikova and
Huh.
etc. And Spartak is apparently also some sort of like really desolate, post-industrial looking, awful place.
Hmm.
This describes one or two other places like that and says how it seems to him, or apparently, when you have this kind of rough-looking, rough edges, then maybe this gets people to work harder. I mean, it's difficult to know for sure, but it's interesting as an observation.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Cool. And one thing that's interesting about the John Wooden thing that I thought of, how he would prepare a lot for the practices and they were very designed. So it's kind of like what Montessori did. Put a lot of thought into the design, kind of make that design or preparation sacred, and then kind of let the students go.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, that's a great connection there, actually. So I
thank you.
think that on a very deep fundamental level, yeah, both of them are designing kind of pedagogical experiences. One of them with the idea that there's not going to be an instructor there, so that's the Mario Montessori type
Hmm.
of idea. Whereas the other one is designing one with the idea, well, there is going to be an instructor there, which is John Wooden himself, and he's going to be, prodding people and telling them what to do all the time, and he's sort of using himself as a resource, kind of. I think I get the sense, and again, this is where my knowledge is a bit limited, but I get the sense that part of the Mario Montessori way of thinking is about the idea that there's a wonderful word, iatrogenics, which comes from this guy called Nassim Taleb, who
Hmm.
writes about randomness. Anyway, but he talks about how sometimes doctors cause you harm because they feel like they need to do something, but if you were left alone, you'd actually
Yeah.
fare better.
Hmm.
And there are some people who talk about how it's possible for a teacher to do that. It's possible for an instructor to actually get in the way of learning.
Oh yeah.
And I feel that there's a little bit of that spirit in some of what Mario Montessori was thinking. And I think maybe, I think there is a bit of room for that maybe in like really young kids, for example, because like they just need a lot of free play
Hmm.
to a large extent. And it seems that by her kind of thinking, again, I may get this wrong because I don't know that much about the Montessori method, but to some extent, it seems like her way of thinking is if you minimize the amount of time that a teacher or instructor has to be involved, then the kid kind of has more of a sense of freedom and more of a sense of play, which is good for the kid. But at the same time, if you structure the pedagogical environment really carefully, then you can provide enough guidance that they actually end up learning, for example, the alphabet at a very young age.
Hmm. Hmm. And so you think she had, like the idea you're talking about, you think she would maybe interfere a little bit too much? Like to be a teacher like that or what?
I think that, well, again, I'm worried about stepping into things I don't know that much about, but I get the sense that part of the philosophy is that young kids don't want you to prod them,
Mm.
and it's not going to be good for their development at some level, when they're learning stuff. I think that's at least the philosophy behind it. Again, I'm just going to have to keep on caveating that I'm stepping into the unknown a bit with these speculations.
Yeah. And so you're saying she would not be one of the ones that would interfere too much?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's from what I know about it too. And then of course there's like Montessori done right versus people who claim they're Montessori but are not actually.
I can believe that, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. So,
Yeah, so there's some schools that claim they're Montessori which are not really Montessori because they don't follow the principles, don't follow the fundamentals.
okay.
Um, and so I think didn't Escalante and Collins prepare a lot too? They were very well prepared, everything laid out ahead of time.
Yeah, so it comes across it comes so interestingly with John Wooden, it comes across much more in the book, much more explicitly. We
Hmm.
hear about his special time. You're not allowed to interrupt his
Hmm.
special time. Nobody can come in and interfere with it. It's
Interesting.
his hour where he has to be. It's like being in church or something, you know? It's like you
Hmm.
just can't come in and tell him anything. Like he's busy,
Interesting.
in a special kind of busy, right? Whereas with Marva Collins, we actually in her book see her talking about how important it is to prepare, but we don't see very much of like what her preparation schedule or activities were actually like. We just hear her saying, preparation is really important. Make sure you're prepared. But there's no demonstration in the book of exactly what it looks like for her. With Escalante, then we again, I mean, mostly that book about Escalante, they're all written a little bit differently. That one doesn't say very much of what his opinion is directly. We just have like quoted speech from him, for example, to get a sense of some of his ideas. We mainly see him through his actions, whereas in the Marva Collins book, we do hear some of her own words and what she thinks. So with Escalante, I think the main thing is that we see him in a number of cases looking at things he's trying to teach and trying to find ways to teach it. And that's kind of his long-term, if you like, preparation as he builds up ways of, they're often very silly. He uses humor a lot. Very silly ways of approaching math stuff, but then it does hook the kids because they kind of get into his special world that he builds around this. Even, for example, he has his own vocabulary, his own name for various things in maths. He says stuff like secret agent is his name for a minus sign outside a set of brackets, so you need to flip the signs. Or like rifle pass from Magic Johnson is his word for straight line. And he just like makes this stuff up, and it's kind of a special. He
Interesting.
has a special bond with the kids around it. Basically, it's like a kind of inside a conspiracy of maths. It's kind of funny, I
Huh.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then it makes it more real and more concrete, adds more drama to it.
Mm.
Hmm. But so, um, what was I going to say? Something about the preparation. Um, oh yeah, I was going to say it's good that at least some of them you get to deal with that. I think that's one thing that comes up in the history of science too. Um, in ancient Greece, people used to just present their final conclusions, and then Galileo and Newton were affected to some extent like that. But Kepler, for example, was one of the first ones I think to present the mistakes he made in his process of learning and describe
Mm.
how he did things. And I think that's very important. I think Newton did that to
It's
some
very
extent.
interesting. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah.
Um, and then thankfully we've got a little bit of the how do you pronounce it? Almagest from Archimedes. So we learned a little bit about how he discovered some of the theorems he did. He'd
Mm.
get pieces of wood, I guess, have a shape he wanted, have someone cut it for him, and then put it in some water and see when the solid was stable and when it wasn't, and then he'd know when it was stable. He'd know he had a theorem.
Hmm. Oh, I didn't know. I know about another method he had, but I didn't know about that one.
Which one are you
Oh,
familiar with?
he had this kind of integration, like sort of calculus-like approach to some problems, which was only discovered in something like 10 or 20 years ago. Like
Huh?
it turned
Wow.
up in a
Hmm.
book in a monastery.
Wow.
So just yeah, people just noticed this. The parchment that these things are written on. Sometimes they scrubbed the ink out of the parchment and
Hmm.
then rewrote over it, but then the ink would seep out again over time, so you could
Hmm.
actually see, even though they'd written some whatever it was, could have been a copy of the Bible, for example, onto this parchment, then actually you saw some of his kind of Archimedes' drawings of how he approaches problems was seeping out of the parchment, and then they managed and from this Greek monastery, they managed to get some historians of science in to document
Wow.
that stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like briefly, what was the thing he knew about calculus?
To be honest, I don't really remember it well
Yeah,
enough. But
I'm
he
like
was
that
using
too.
a kind of analytical, basically like a sort of limit-like method of
Huh.
cutting things into very small pieces in order to solve
Oh,
some problems.
okay. Yeah, I think I'm familiar with that then. Good. Cool. Um, but yeah, so that's one thing I try to do a lot more when I'm teaching or in general. Try to talk about the how, not just the what. Um, And I look forward to reading some of these, listening on Audible or reading some of these books that you've talked about in your podcast. Listening to some of your podcasts on them again. It's like some good material. I recommend it for folks. But and then one thing I like in some of the podcasts you've done in this stuff, we mentioned the fundamentals with John Wooden, but so a little context first. Like when I was getting my teacher's credentials in Texas, I had some professor who was all proud of herself because instead of calling some things worksheets, they didn't like drill. They call it drill and kill at the time. Drill's all bad. Don't do any drill. Don't do practice. Just do creative stuff. And this like 40 or 50-year-old would all puff herself up with fake pride and call them work shits. She thought that was just the greatest thing. It's like, I'm so clever. They're work shits.
Yeah.
That was sad. And of course, I couldn't say anything because I'm a little kid. So, to them, getting a degree, and they're just going to think I'm stupid. And I've even had some of that happen, But yeah, I like that you, in talking about these different great teachers, bring up the fact and stress the fact that drill is very important. And you've already said it some here in this podcast episode. You get the drill, do drill, get some of the stuff down, and then you're freed up to be more creative, as you said the basketball players could be. They got some of the passes down.
Exactly.
Yeah. And have you heard about some of that in what is it? GTD? David Allen, I think, Getting Things Done. I think he talks about some of that too, how some people say our mind is better at being creative than at memorizing stuff. And so one thing he does in the GTD method to help people be more productive at work, I think specifically he works with executives, business executives. He recommends writing things down or keeping a recorder with you and making verbal notes throughout the day and then writing them down at the end of the day. So he recommends writing things down a lot to free your mind up to be creative.
That's an interesting connection here with this kind of thinking. Actually, there's something called the Zeigarnik effect, which is relevant as well.
How do you spell that?
Zeigarnik. Zeigarnik effect. It's named after a psychologist.
Spell it one more time, if you would, please. Zeig.
Sorry. Yeah,
Sorry.
That's right. We call it Z over here.
Yeah.
Zeig. Arnik. Zeigarnik.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes. So, I mean, to give maybe a brief story about the Zeigarnik effect, there was originally inspired by a situation where some psychologists went to have lunch somewhere, and then the waiter took an order of maybe something like 10 people's food, 10 people's order, and he took it all in his head, and he didn't write anything down. And then came out with exactly the right stuff. And they were all so surprised that he could remember all those different things. And then afterwards, one of the psychologists came up to him and said, well, it's amazing that you could remember that I had whatever it was, that I had the salmon. I don't know. And then he said, what? Like, you had the salmon? I don't remember. So he could remember them all, but he forgot them all immediately afterwards once he gave them out. I mean, in a sense, you could think this is a little bit reminiscent of sometimes what people do when they cram for a test. They do a little bit something like that. But yeah, this is got to do with, there's this kind of mental effect where if you need a piece of information now or soon, it will sort of take up some of your mental space, so to speak. But then once you don't need it anymore, you just forget it. Unless you've gone through some sort of process where you've been committing it to memory. So yeah, in terms of, I do want to touch on what you were saying about drill and kill and about memorization, about creativity. So I really like the way you phrased it with, if you get some fundamental stuff down, you've got the space to be creative, and that's a really important idea. I think that's a powerful idea. And so now with things like, talking about memorization, it's important to recognize how important memory is to learning, and that learning is largely or possibly entirely about memory. And the thing is, like, memorizing, usually what that means is some kind of completely is basically, it seems very dry, and it is very dry, to just get a new fact and stick it in your head any way you can, and it's just completely, it's quite disconnected from everything. Now, there are some cases where, so basically that's really inefficient, and people recognize that. They go, well, it's hard for me to memorize things. I don't seem to get very far, and afterwards the results don't feel very good because I just have a few isolated facts which easily disappear from my memory. And the thing is, I think the way to think about that kind of memorization isn't that it should never, ever, ever, ever be used, but just that it's a very inefficient method, but sometimes you don't really have a choice. So, for example, learning vocabulary in a foreign language, sometimes there are ways to make it easier, but a lot of the time, unfortunately, you don't really have another choice, and you kind of have to do that. But if you know if you like, it gets better because you can start to like form sentences and you connect words together a bit more, and then they're easier to remember in your mind. But sometimes there are some things you need to know, and you just have no other recourse but to use that method. If you do have another method, then that's great. I mean, the best thing is to connect it with something you already know, and that's why you have a Matthew effect in education. Was a big reason why you have a Matthew effect in education, that the rich get richer, and in terms of knowledge, the people who already know a lot will learn faster than the people who don't know very much yet, because they can connect new knowledge to their existing knowledge, and it is preserved better because it makes sense to them because it's connected. And it can only be connected because they had that previous knowledge. So it grows in a kind of exponential fashion. That the more you have, the easier it is to get more. And conversely, if you have less, then it's harder to actually even make a start. So yeah, that's what I'd say about memorization and drill. It's certainly also the case that you don't need to use drill literally all the time.
Yeah.
Right? It's a tool, and you have to use it in the right context, and you have to be sensitive to whether someone is a beginner in something and how much background knowledge they have. But to simply demonize it as a kind of a taboo method is, I think, it's a bit of a silly position to hold. I think the world isn't really divided into people who believe in constantly drilling and doing nothing else, and other people who believe in never drilling and only ever being creative. I think, if you look at the really good teachers, they do use this method when they need it. Marva Collins did an awful lot in order to get the kids to learn phonics. She did loads of drilling. That's what they needed. Then they started reading amazing books, and she started having incredible intellectual discussions with them at a level which would, it'd be intellectually satisfying even for me as an adult with a reasonable education, but these were 8-year-olds, but they were having amazing high quality conversations. They needed to learn how to read the alphabet and they had to use drill, but it's not like she was drilling them the whole time. It's like she needed it for that section, and then she started doing other things. It's a tool that you can use appropriately. I think you might have asked me a question and I just went off on one completely different side, but hopefully that was relevant to what you were talking about.
Yeah, basically. It's an open-ended question. Different things we can say. Not a multiple choice. So, but, and I think that's what John Wooden did more anyway. He put drill in context. From what I understand, it'd be in the practice. I don't think the players ever stood around and just passed the ball back and forth to each other in a straight line or anything, right?
I mean, I'm sure he definitely had exercises around passing, but he would have made them the kind of exercises that were both physically demanding and actually develop their skill. There wouldn't be things that would be like, well, this is so easy, why are we, this isn't really stretching us. They always were feeling stretched. Yeah. So he probably had some kind of passing exercise which made them feel stretched. I mean, he had lots of levers he could pull. If there was an exercise that they were like, this is look, he looked at them and they looked like they weren't working that hard, he would just speed the same exercise up. He'd be like, okay, do the same thing, but do it 50% faster, and he would be able to make that happen, and that would push them. So he always had a way of doing it.
And that's interesting. It's like the same thing he's doing to his players, he's had to do to himself. He's got to have all this stuff down, memorized, mastered, so that he can adapt and be creative in the situation. And go with the flow. You got to drill. Okay, let's speed it up. You got to know to speed it up. The way you're saying that, are you agreeing or disagreeing?
No, yeah. Like, okay, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that the preparation was a major part of that he didn't only rely on his ability to crack out the right thing at the right moment. He did, obviously, preparation was a part of. It's kind of like I mean, crutch is a bad word, but it's kind of like it's a way to make sure that he would still be running a good session, even if things started to become overwhelming for him as an instructor. As in, it wouldn't become overwhelming because he'd prepared. But certainly, I'm sure that teachers definitely get better with time. We see it with
Yeah.
in various cases. Like we see, I'm sure it was true of John Wooden as well. He was actually an English teacher as well, but we don't hear much about that side of his life.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, but so Marva Collins, she had more than 10 years of experience before we actually see her do what she does. So she had this whole long period of learning to be a better teacher. Same with Jaime Escalante. We actually see it in much more detail.
And that's one thing, sorry to interrupt, but that's one thing I like. You talk about, in talking about Jaime Escalante, people ought to listen to that in the book, and therefore in your episode, you talk specifically about how he developed, some stuff he was doing wrong, how he changed. That's like very valuable. But go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, it is valuable. It is also quite inspiring. It's inspiring to see your heroes when they were beginners.
Yeah. Then it helps us see that even though we might be crap or think we're crap, it's something we can improve. Yay.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental part of a good mindset for learning and education. It's like, yeah, you probably are crap. Like, just you're probably going to have to live with that for now. But look, if you put the work in, you can be like this incredible, heroic individual. Like, the difference between you and them is mainly work.
Yeah. And, yeah, that's a good point. And we'll maybe close on that. I got someone else I got to get ready for in half an hour. I need some coffee. My brain's getting like, seems like it's only working on 70% now. Need a little more coffee to like kick things up. Getting a little brain dead just because of, I guess, sleep wasn't good quality last night. Kept waking up a bit. But I think that's it. Because it sure the heck ain't the discussion. This is like nice. So, hope you enjoy that, folks. Stash, do you have any last words for today?
That's all. Thanks very much for inviting me to the podcast.
Yeah, enjoyed the discussion. Very valuable. I like some of the disagreements we had too. It's important getting us to think about things, see that a topic's relevant, question what we believe, learn more about it, think more about it, maybe develop our idea more or change our opinion if we find we're wrong. It's awesome. But and then hopefully you can come back on sometime. There's so much more to discuss, like Bruce Lee, what you say about the brain-based learning. I like what you say about, and develop more what you've said in your podcast about Wooden and Escalante, how they were very intense, but then Wooden was more laid back, but Escalante sometimes he learned from, like he and some people he learned from would maybe like insult someone sometimes just for a purpose and things like that.
He was a very particular, very, very unusual character. He had a special way of connecting with his students, which did involve some apparently insulting them from time to time. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like, he's not being rude. I like that. It's like insulting, but it's like the tough love thing, I think. Maybe the way some people put it. But cool. So, but awesome. And thank you again for being on the podcast. And do you have any last words?
No, that's all. It's my pleasure.
Cool. All right. Awesome. Hope you enjoyed it, folks. And we will talk to y'all again soon. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks, folks. Bye.